Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Plato's Apology, a very important work by Plato, and also in many ways a very nice introduction to Platonic philosophy. So let us begin. So here's the basic sketch. Plato's Apology is a defense, apology in the old meaning of to provide an apology or defense of. So it's not like in sometimes people say nowadays a to ask for an apology is to ask for forgiveness or something like that. That's not what's happening at all. Socrates' apology is Socrates' defense before the Athenian court. So the kind of document that it is a recording of Plato of Socrates defending himself before the Athenian court. So Socrates comes to court. He's accused of something. He's accused of being of corrupting the youth. That's the heart of the accusation. And here's the way in which the accusers puts it. Here's what the accusers think that Socrates is doing. Socrates is to be, punished because he's disrespecting authority. He's challenging the established tradition. He's questioning the stories about the Athenian gods, and crucially, the way in which those stories about the Athenian gods shape the society, the morality, the customs, the way of relating to people, the way of distributing resources, the way of allocating honors, and so on. So those stories, those traditions settle a lot of the society, settle a lot of the philosophical questions about the nature of goodness, friendship, love, the gods, one's relationship to the gods. So a lot of the deep philosophical questions, those traditions settle. They provide answers to those. And that's typically the case. That's what traditions do, right? We have our own traditions. Humans have traditions that settle those questions. And that's how society runs, right? By having answers to those questions and then acting on the basis of those answers. And the accusation is that Socrates is failing to be a good player. He's failing to conform to the tradition and allow things to run, allow the society to continue. He's challenging the tradition. That's the accusation. And by doing that, he's corrupting the youth. He's corrupting the youth precisely by teaching them to also rebel against the tradition, precisely by teaching them not to conform to the tradition, and crucially, not to endorse or accept those answers to philosophical questions about things that matter, like love, friendship, and so on. Here's what Socrates says, though. Socrates says, well, that's not quite what I'm doing. I'm not challenging, I'm not disrespecting, I'm not rebelling against. There's something slightly different. I teach the youth not to merely blindly follow the tradition, and crucially, the philosophical answers embedded within the tradition, right? Goodness, value, love, the gods. Socrates sees himself as enabling the youth to think for themselves. Socrates is asking philosophical questions. He doesn't have a lot of answers. He has a lot of philosophical questions. And he's teaching the students, the youth, to ask those questions themselves, not merely to repeat what they've been told by the authorities, but the poets that tell the stories about the Greek gods and so on, the people in political office. Uh, Socrates' basic message is something like don't blindly, unreflectively accept the answers to philosophical questions you've been fed by your tradition since birth. Think about it, use your reason, ask whether or not those are the correct answers, the reasonable, the credible answers to those deep, important questions. To teach the youth to care about asking those questions, to think for themselves, is not corrupting them. Quite the opposite, says Socrates. It is enabling them to grow, to mature, and to attain the truth. We contemporary people, we care a lot about individuality. We think of thinking for ourselves as an essential kind of aspect of our development, our growth, our authenticity. Socrates doesn't quite think that. He thinks that thinking for yourself matters because it leads to truth. If you just blindly accept what you've been told, chances are you won't get the truth because you're not even thinking about it. The thinking for yourself from Socrates' eyes is mostly instrumental for the sake of attaining truth. So at the heart of Socrates teaching the youth to think for themselves and to ask questions is that he's trying to inculcate in the youth kind of a desire for truth, a love of truth, philosophy, love of truth, is what Socrates is inculcating the students. He wants the youth to think for themselves so that they're more likely to attain truth and the kind of truth that matters, the nature of friendship, the nature of love, the nature of the gods, and so on. That kind of truth is the most important one. It's the one that shapes your understanding of reality, the way you respond to the world. And that's what Socrates is inculcating then to the youth. He should not be punished for that. He should be rewarded for that, he claims. So that's the heart of the story. This work is great for many reasons. One of them is that we get in this treatise, we get the story of Socrates' philosophical journey. Here's the story of the philosophical journey. So Chaerephon, a friend of Socrates, long ago when this was recorded, asked the Delphi oracle if there was any person who's wiser than Socrates. And the article, much to Socrates' amazement, said no. The oracle said, the claim from the gods claim, that Socrates was the wisest person. And Socrates was deeply puzzled by this. He was surprised because he thought of himself as very ignorant. He thought that there were a lot of questions. He had a lot of questions, what is friendship, what is love, but he didn't really have the very many answers. And he was also surprised because he started looking around. And people, especially people in power, but people in general, acted as though they knew. They claimed to know. It seemed that there were a lot of people that possessed wisdom. Wisdom is the knowledge of things that matter, things that are worth having. They, a lot of people acted as though they have good answers to these philosophical questions, as though they knew the answers. And Socrates had a lot of questions, but not that many answers. So he was puzzled. He said, like, I don't know these answers. A lot of people claim to. So this initiated Socrates' philosophical journey. He was puzzled by the oracle, what the oracle said. He started inquiring. He started examining people, especially those that claim to know. And here's what he says about one of his first encounters with a politician, someone who claimed to know what justice was and had organized the state. A great philosophical question and answer. Socrates says, and when I examined him, a politician, and talked with him, men of Athens, my experience was something like this. I thought that this man seemed wise to many people. A lot of people thought the man was wise. He knew what justice was. And especially to himself. He himself, the politician, thought of himself as someone who knew the nature of justice. He knew what the just state was, and he was trying to bring it about. But Socrates noticed the man wasn't. He merely thought he was wise. He merely thought he knew what justice was, but he really didn't. That was the result of the dialogue with Socrates. And when Socrates noticed that the person merely thought they knew what justice was, but didn't actually know it, then Socrates tried to show him that he merely thought he was wise, but he really wasn't. And as a result, this politician started disliking Socrates. Um, Socrates thought, as someone who wants to know the truth, that if you falsely believe that you know what justice is, and you truly want to know the truth, when someone comes around and shows to you that your conception of justice is mistaken, the lover of truth will be happy. They would abandon their conception of justice and say, oh, thank you. I was doing all these things on the basis of this false assumption, this false conception. And the person who's committed to truth, the philosopher, would rejoice in the recognition of their having a false assumption. Now they can discard it and they'll have one few false assumption. But it's not what happened. The politician dislikes Socrates. So what this revealed is that the politician did not really care about truth or wisdom. What they care about was being perceived by others as having wisdom and knowledge, and perhaps very likely their position of power. What they wanted was the position of power and the perception that they knew, not actually knowing. This happened to Socrates a lot of the times. He went around Athens, and most people that claimed to know after dialoguing with Socrates for a while, it turns out they didn't, and they got annoyed with Socrates. So one of the realizations is that Socrates is kind of one of the first persons in history to want to know the truth about these crucial questions instead of merely blindly perpetuating the tradition. The way Plato paints the picture, Socrates becomes the historical awakening of human reason when the person, the mature person, doesn't merely accept what they've been told. but actually thinks about it for themselves, actually wants to attain the truth, not merely perpetuate the tradition they've been given. And much to Socrates' surprise, most people were not him. Most people didn't care about the truth. Most people just wanted to have their power, have the perception that they knew, but not actually knowing, not actually truth. Most people were not philosophers. So that's also the basic shape of the historical career, the philosophical career of Socrates. Let's actually start looking at some of the details of his philosophy and what Plato thought. Socrates, the way in which Socrates embodied the nature of philosophy, the Socratic wisdom that becomes the beginning of philosophy as we understand it. And here's kind of one of the realizations that Socrates had that he thinks is what the oracle at Delphi meant. Here's what the oracle meant, according to Socrates. I'm wiser than that person, for it's likely that neither of us knows anything fine and good. That's Socrates' definition for account of her way of talking about wisdom. But he thinks he knows something he does not know, whereas I, since I don't in fact know, don't think that I do either. At any rate, it seems that I'm wiser than he is in just this one small way. That what I don't know, I don't think that I know. So, put differently, Socrates is wiser than this politician because the politician has false beliefs about justice. The politician falsely believes that he knows what justice is. And that's more foolish or less wise than Socrates' position, one in which Socrates does not know what justice is, but knows that he does not know what justice is. Socrates' philosophy or Socratic wisdom, the beginning of philosophy is that moment of humility, intellectual humility, and the recognition that deep, big questions like what's the nature of justice might be something we don't yet know. Socrates does not know, but he knows that he doesn't know. And it is wiser to do that because now the possibility of inquiring into the nature of justice opens up to him. If someone blindly, narrow mindedly believes that they know, they're not even going to question, right? They're just going to act without thinking about it. And that unreflective way of going about in the world is unphilosophical. Socrates is claiming here is more foolish than he who recognizes their lack of knowledge and thereby begins inquiry into truth. That's the beginning of philosophy. Socrates continues. But men of Athens, the good craftsmen also seem to me to have the very same flaw as the poets. So he goes through the talking to people. Because he performs his own craft well, each of them also thought himself to be wisest about other things, the most important ones. So this is an important observation of humanity in general. I don't think that things have changed much since Socrates' time. When some people are good at something, they know how to build a bridge. Those are the craftsmen. They can do things with their hands. They build, bridges, ships, and so on. When they can build it, they can build a bridge very well. Here's the observation of Socrates. They foolishly think that because they're experts at building bridges, that somehow that expertise extends to the things that are more important, like whether God exists, what's the nature of justice, friendship, how to go about treating other people with decency and respect. Those are the real questions. Those are the important questions. What's the nature of the self or the soul? In craftsmen, people that build bridges, mistakenly many times go from the I'm an expert on this thing. Now I can speak about those other things that are very important. And of course, that's a faulty thinking, right? That's fallacious. That's not credible. That's foolish thinking. Um, so a lot more happens in the apology. I'm just gonna not go through all the details. But at some point, when Socrates realizes that he's a lot of people are being unhappy with him, and that he might even face death, that he might face accusations, he thinks about the possibility of just stop doing what he's doing, right? Stop talking to people and trying to philosophize with people. Why can't he do it? Why doesn't he just stop doing what he's doing and going and talking to people and trying to ask philosophical questions and then get them annoyed at the end because they're not philosophers? Here's what Socrates says. Why can't he just mind his own business and leave people alone and stop annoying them? Socrates replies to these questions. You see, if I say that to do that, to stop philosophizing, would be to disobey the God, and that this is why I can't mind my own business, you won't believe me, since you'll suppose that I'm being ironical. But again, if I say that it's the greatest good of man to discuss virtue every day, And the other things you've heard me discuss and examine myself and others about, on the grounds that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. You will believe me even less when I say that. But in fact, things are just as I claim them to be, men of Athens, though it isn't easy to convince you of them. So, in other words, why can Socrates mind his own business, stop talking to people, stop annoying people, that pointing out that they don't know, they don't have any wisdom? He says, because an unexamined life is not worth living. If someone merely blindly perpetuates the tradition that they've been brought up in, they've been fed this conception of justice, they just repeat it, they just act on it, that kind of life is not as valuable or as worth living as one in which you engage in self-examination, critical investigation, philosophical inquiry, discussing the nature of virtue, the soul, the gods. Doing that, examining those crucial questions, is an ingredient in the good life. Is the awakening of reason for the recognition of truth. This pursuit of truth is an element in the good life. That's why. That's one of the reasons why Socrates cannot stop, because he would be giving up on the good life, examining virtue. But he also mentions the second one. He says that he thinks that the Delphi oracles claim is something like a calling to Socrates himself. Uh, Socrates has the calling of the god to do this. Philosophy has been a particular vocation for Socrates. The gods called Socrates to philosophize. So obedience to the gods is one of the reasons why he must philosophize. And philosophy being a way of having a more fulfilling, more satisfying life, an examined life, is the second reason. So I want to flag that a lot more happens in the apology. I want to flag something crucial that happens, and this happens pretty early on. And this is trying to figure out what it is to do philosophy, what it is to be a philosopher. For the way Plato paints the picture, Socrates is the great philosopher. What he does is what a philosopher ought to do. And here are some of the main kind of distinctions, the main characteristics of what it is to be a philosopher. This happens like page one. Here's what Socrates says. Quote, I don't know, men of Athens, how you were affected by my accusers. As for me, I was almost carried away by them. They spoke so persuasively, and yet almost nothing they said is true. So here Socrates is making a distinction between himself and the accusers. And the accusers are going to be like the sophist, um, a person that looks like a philosopher, but deep down it is not. It is just a superficial similarity. And the distinction here is between the philosopher, the one who cares about the truth, who says what is true, who's after truth, who's a lover of truth, philosopher, um, and he who merely seeks to persuade despite the truth. So, oh, my apologies. There we go. So philosophers seek truth, not mere persuasion. It is the sophist that seeks mere persuasion, that is despite of truth. So mere persuasion is to convince the interlocutor that you're correct, and to do so regardless of the truth. That's what the accusers, what the sophists do. What Socrates does is he wants to know the truth. He says the truth. He's after. He's seeking the truth. Um, Socrates continues. Rather, just as I claim, they have said little or nothing true, whereas from me you'll hear the whole truth, but not by these men of Athens expressed in elegant language like theirs, arranged in the fine words and phrases. Instead, I put my trust in the justice of what I say. Here's another crucial distinction of the philosopher. The sophist uses vocabulary to kind of capture you, to kind of lure you to. There's this strong rhetoric that is used by the sophist. The point of using language for the sophist is to kind of dazzle you with their verbal abilities. The philosopher, by contrast, does not do any of that. The philosopher puts their trust in the justice and truth of what they say. Language for the philosopher is a means for conveying information and ideas, not to elaborate and not to present them in an elaborate kind of a way. That's more poetry. That's not philosophy. Philosophy is conveying clearly and carefully the ideas. It is the truth that is driving, not the dazzling of people with the vocabulary in order to persuade them because of that. So language is a means of communicating truth, not a mere rhetorical effect. Here's another side note that Socrates also puts forward that I want to highlight. You see, many people have been accusing me in front of you for many years now. The earlier accusers, gentlemen, are more dangerous. They got a hold of you from childhood and persuaded you with the accusations against me, accusations no more true than the current ones. So Socrates is pointing out that even though there are the ones accusers that are presenting the charges before the Athenian court now, that is the result of a lifelong life of philosophy in which some people were not philosophers, they were annoyed with him, and they developed this kind of antipathy towards him. And those started telling other people, hey, worry about Socrates, and started kind of poisoning the well, poisoning the waters against Socrates. And the point here is something like they're going to be a lot harder to convince because they were told bad things about me when they were young. And when you're young, you just absorb what people tell you. Right? You don't think about it. You just imitate. You just absorb. You kind of you're inculcated into ways of thinking, and it's hard to separate those later on. When you're old, when you attain the age of reason, you start thinking about yourself. You don't just kind of erase everything. Like you already have all of these beliefs. You have this personality. A lot of things have happened such that it is hard for you to assess your own self critically and carefully. And if part of yourself, part of the tradition includes this negative conception of Socrates, it's going to take a lot of effort and work on your part to like kind of separate yourself from that tradition. They have become part of the way you look at the world. The basic idea is something like prejudices grounded in tradition are very hard to assess rationally. It takes a lot of dedication, it takes a lot of self reflection, it takes a lot of commitment to truth to be able to distinguish your prejudices and see the way in which they kind of maliciously, perniciously affect the way in which you think and you understand and you make sense of the world. So they're serious obstacles to philosophical thinking. The sophist merely acts from prejudice. The philosopher tries their best to see their own prejudices and to undo them, to see work from reason and evidence, not merely the blind tradition they've been handed on to. So this gives us the distinction. I'm just going to lay it down and we'll be done for today. So on the one hand, there are the sophists. They're the intellectually vicious. They're the ones that don't know how to think well. Then the one there's something deficient about the way in which they relate to truth. Um, Main characteristics, as I already said, is that they seek pure persuasion. It's not that they seek persuasion as such. People can seek to persuade others, and that's fine. It is the pure part that is the problem. It is the detachment from truth that is the that is the what makes them intellectually vicious. To try to persuade someone else, it's fine. To try to persuade someone else, regardless of the truth, regardless of who's correct, that's when you're intellectually vicious. They rely on strong rhetoric. Part of the way in which they go about convincing others is by the vocabulary that they use, not the ideas conveyed by that vocabulary. Use reason as a mere instrument. They first have a conclusion in mind, typically what they've been inculcated, what the tradition has told them, and they don't think about it. They just find ways of justifying it after the fact. They rationalize the reasons for the beliefs they already hold, the beliefs they were told when they were growing up. In this case, that Socrates is a bad person. They don't actually think about the evidence. They don't look at the case. They don't look at Socrates. They just come to the table, the discussion table, equipped with the assumption, with the conclusion already that Socrates is a bad person, and they use reason as an instrument. They try to find evidence to justify that already adhered onto, they're already committed onto conclusion. That's not reasoning well. They are uncritical and unreflective. The sophists do not take a step back and try to look into their soul. They look into their psyche, look into their personality and their history. They do not try to unearth the prejudices and the biases and the assumptions that naturally arose as they grew up. Uh, they are they look for sheer cleverness. It's not true that it's driving them, but to appear to be intelligent regardless of what they say. Um, this is not actually in the text, but I'm just going to throw it in because it gives you a better picture of what the sophist is. It is someone who has selective recognition of evidence. And you can see that's vice in like some journalists. Sometimes journalists have a view in mind already, something like immigrants are bad people. And that's they don't look at the evidence to justify that. They just write an article in the journal, in some newspaper article with a conclusion in mind already. Oh, immigrants in our country are destroying other bad people. And then they look around, and surely enough, they're bad immigrants, right? They find evidence for their antecedently held evidence conclusion, and they just publish an article that way. uh, when they encounter evidence contrary to it, wonderful immigrants that are doing pretty well, that are respectful, they just ignore that because it's not relevant to the conclusions. They don't try to amass all of the relevant evidence, and then on the basis of that evidence come to a reasonable conclusion. They have the conclusion already, and they look for selectively identify or recognize evidence, dismissing the one that is contrary to their hypotheses and emphasizing the one that suits them. That's not thinking well. That's being intellectually vicious. The philosopher is the kind of mirror opposite of this. Is the good guy, the person who knows how to think. They're the intellectually virtuous. They seek truth, in particular wisdom, the truth that matters. Uh, they use simple language instead of strong rhetoric. The point of language is conveying communication, not to dazzle people with the vocabulary that that you own a thesaurus is not as impressive. What you say with the words you use is what's impressive. Reason is the guide. Reason is prior to the conclusions. They look at the evidence and try to see where it leads and follow evidence where it leads. Uh, Crucially, philosopher reflects upon, has an examined life, reflects upon the received views. When they reach the age of reason, 2025, whenever that might be, they take a step back and look at the assumptions they've been fed, the assumptions they've been given by the tradition, gender roles, the nature of friendship, the nature of love, whether God exists, what the just society looks like. And the philosopher thinks about it, starts asking questions, doesn't blindly challenge, but doesn't blindly accept either. They think about the adequacy of those answers embedded in the tradition that has raised them, reflect upon their views. They engage in dialectic, which is the kind of process of dialogue between others, which is what Socrates is doing. And finally, they follow the evidence where it leads. So Socrates is the philosopher, the pragmatic philosopher, the one who wants to know the truth, the wisdom, things that matter. The sophist is someone who acts in similar ways, but if you look at carefully, you realize they're doing something very different. They are intellectually vicious. So here is the call from the Apology: be a philosopher, pursue truth. Beware of the traps of sophistry. Beware of the traps of very easily falling back on you what you've been told without thinking about it. Avoid sophistry. Pursue truth. I'll stop right here. I'll see you next time.